The LAII at the University of New Mexico promotes and supports interdisciplinary teaching, research, and meaningful public engagement to advance the production and dissemination of knowledge about Latin America and Iberia. Latin America is designated as one of 7 priority areas of research for UNM, and we proudly contribute to both the university's intellectual community as well as global discourse through our programming. Founded in 1889, the University of New Mexico sits on the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia, the original peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache, since time immemorial, have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to indigenous peoples. We gratefully recognize this history. Before I introduce today's speaker, Pascale Bonnefoy, I would want to acknowledge the generous support of the Western Hemisphere Center of the Guadalupe Institute, which has made it possible to bring Pascale to speak at the Albuquerque Museum and UNM. Professor Bonnefoy gave a fantastic talk yesterday at the museum related to the current exhibition, Dictators and the Disappeared, and if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to go. I also want to thank Russ Davidson, former curator of the Latin American collections at the UNM Libraries, co-curator with Leslie Kim of the Dictators and the Disappeared exhibition, and translator of Professor Bonnefoy's most recent book, The Investigative Brigade. And we'd like to thank Russ for connecting the LAII with Pascale. So I'm honored and delighted to introduce our speaker today, Pascale Bonnefoy, whose talk is titled Chile After Pinochet, The Limits of Post-Dictatorship Transition. Professor Bonnefoy is a journalist who has written extensively about the Pinochet dictatorship, transitional justice, and the complex ties between the dictatorship and its aftermath with Chilean society and politics today. She has a BA in International Affairs from George Washington University and a master's also in International Affairs from the University of Chile. Much of her professional career has been as a freelance reporter for Chilean media, a producer and researcher for documentary films in Chile and abroad, and as a correspondent for news outlets such as Global Post, Catholic News Service, and Latin America Press. She was a stringer in Chile for the South American Bureau of the Washington Post from 1997 to 2004, and has been a stringer in Chile for the Rio de Janeiro Bureau of the New York Times for the past 18 years. Some of you may have seen 2 of her articles that came out recently in the Times tied to the 50th anniversary of the military coup in Chile. She's an associate professor of journalism at the University of Chile and author of 3 books dealing with Chile and the dictatorship, one of which was translated to English and published last year by the University of North Carolina Press, and that is the one titled The Investigative Brigade, Hunting Human Rights Criminals in Post-Pinochet Chile. With that, please join me in welcoming Professor Pascale Bonnefoy.
All right, so for those of you who went to the event yesterday at the museum, I just warn you that there will be a certain overlap on the issues we're going to be touching, but it's going to be a different kind of focus. And today I'm going to talk about, well, post-dictatorship transition, which are very different in each Latin American country, and Chile's was particularly different in the way that it came to be about. So we're going to talk about, or I'm going to talk about, that transition, the limits, and specifically what that meant for investigating human rights crimes or how to deal with human rights crimes. Can you all hear me still? Good. Okay. So I'm sure you all have different backgrounds on Chile, so I don't know how much I need to explain about dictatorship, but we did have a 17-year dictatorship, military dictatorship from 73 to 1990. A military coup toppled the socialist government of Salvador Allende, and we've been living in a democratic system since March 1990 to this date. But I would say the whole decade of the 1990s was what I'm going to talk about today, which was very kind of conditioned still by the role of the military, by the laws and constitution left by the dictatorship, and fear itself, fear of political instability. So that's what we're going to look at, and I would start first, summary of what Pinochet's condition for transiting towards a democracy meant for the first civilian government of Patricio Elwin, who was a Christian Democrat. The whole transition was kind of negotiated, but it was also built on the 1980 constitution left by Pinochet, which we'll get to in a minute. But since Pinochet remained as commander-in-chief, General Pinochet, the dictator, remained as commander-in-chief of the army for another 8 years, he was the one calling the shots, and he basically and overtly told the civilian government, the future civilian government, that these were his conditions. Can't touch my men, literally, can't touch my men, my family, which was a big issue in a couple of years. The economic model, the Chicago Boys model, later turned into a different kind of model, just the same. But it set the foundations of today's economy, and it really hasn't been touched all that much. Couldn't touch the amnesty law, which it issued in 1978 to cover all crimes between 1973 to 78, except for one, which we'll get to also. And actually that law doesn't cover the crimes afterwards, but the bulk of human rights violations were in that period of time. So it couldn't touch the amnesty law, couldn't touch his family, and he used these phrases that the government needed to protect the prestige of the armed forces and impede any attempts of retaliation against them. Retaliation meaning investigation, for example, of crimes or of corruption, which happened many, many years later, okay? And of course, respect for the 1980 Constitution, which we'll get to. And the government really had no choice because the whole timetable and conditions for a transition to democracy was based on that Constitution that was designed by the military. Worked, okay. This was the Constitution. It was created in 1980 because after the coup in 1973, Congress was, of course, shut down until further notice. So we didn't have Congress until 1990, 73 to 1990. So we just had like decrees, presidential decrees or junta decrees and laws. But there was like no governing constitutional body. So he had, a group of friends, one of them was his cousin who was a lawyer, draft a constitution, a very authoritarian one, in 1980, and which gave him an official 8-year term as president. So this is when he kind of institutionalized and officialized his regime. So he was no longer just like the president of the junta, the military junta. He was also like president of the republic, supreme leader of the nation, captain general, and all that. These were his formal titles. And that also coincided with the rebuilding of the presidential palace, which was bombed during the coup. So, in 1980, he had his constitution, he had his palace, and he had his official 8-year presidential term, okay? So this constitution, of course, was illegitimate in origin, but also because it was approved, or really not approved, in a fraudulent plebiscite. These are images from that plebiscite. We're not talking about the 1988 plebiscite you may know about. This is a yes or no plebiscite for the Constitution, in which you said, national plebiscite, new Constitution for the Republic of Chile, yes or no, and you had to vote. But there were no electoral registers because they had all been burned, literally destroyed after the coup. There was, no control of who could vote or who went to vote. So like, for example, a lot of intelligence agents and military people went more than once, There was no monitoring, no observation, no nothing. So it was completely illegitimate in origin, and this was a complete fraud, okay? So no one really, I'm talking about no one in the opposition, which was the majority of the country, believed in this constitution. I mean, it was just like part of the dictatorship, what dictators do. They didn't give it real legitimacy. But it turns out it was the only thing that actually gave it a timetable to transit out of dictatorship. And there was a lot of discussion in the mid-'80s among different political groups about, really should we be using an illegitimate constitution? Shouldn't we just overthrow the guy? So some people were like armed struggle to overthrow the guy. Some said, we should use this constitution. Others said, no, it just should be civil disobedience and protest. So there are different strategies. And a lot of people resisted using this illegitimate text, in his conditions to get rid of him. Pinochet had no intention of actually leaving, but this is something that he drafted that he thought would favor himself, and it turned out that didn't happen. But this constitution also apart from having this timetable, included what they called authoritarian enclaves, enclaves autoritarias. That's what everyone called it, because they're little pockets of military control or authority over civilian rule. For example, there were 9 designated senators. Of course, now we could have a Congress building, right? So the dictatorship built one, not in Santiago, the capital, but in Valparaiso. Very kind of fascist architecture, I must say. And designated 9 senators. And they would be designated by the commanders-in-chief, by Supreme Court justices who were appointed by Pinochet, by, I think it was the Constitutional Tribunal, which is also appointees by Pinochet. So they had this like block of secure votes for anything, anything to block any intention of a democratic government to make big changes. And a disproportional electoral system which favored usually the right. So it was a very weird, intricate system I can't explain, but you could get less votes and still have a seat in Congress, okay? And this favored the right usually, because most of the votes went, well, it's a long story. But this meant that there was a disproportionate presence of right-wingers in Congress that wasn't true to the actual voting, plus the designated senators. So anything the government did was like blocked all the time. Another enclave that they call was the inability of the president, the civilian president, to name or remove the commanders of the armed forces. I'm talking military, Navy, Army, Army, Navy, Air Force, and Carabineros police. There's 2 police forces. One is the detective force, and one is the Carabineros, which are very militarized, and they actually dress in like, green and like going to war. So that they couldn't remove those commanders-in-chief. So basically what the new civilian government could do was just choose one of the 5 officers that the own commander suggested. Okay, that's the only thing. And it gave the armed forces a role of guarantors of democracy. Okay, they were supposed to guarantee the constitutional order, which gives it a political role in a supposed civilian democracy. And there was also a National Security Council, of course, made up of many of the military leaders and others. And it wasn't an advisory body. It was a body, military-controlled body that could self-convene itself to discuss issues, national or political issues, and come to resolutions about it. So it gave the military a say in everything that the civilian government was doing. So these were all like the main authoritarian enclaves that were in place until 2005. So it's 15 years, okay? And the timetable set by the Constitution, this was another plebiscite. The first one was for the Constitution. This was for the 1988 plebiscite. The timetable, what I mean when I say Pinochet had no intention of really leaving power is that according to the Constitution, the military junta would appoint or would name a candidate for the population to vote yes or no to another 8-year term, or to an 8-year term. And of course, the candidate was none other but Pinochet. So I remember it was like August 30th, I think I remember, because I went to the ceremony in which he was appointed candidate for the plebiscite, like to no one's surprise. And that's when he took off his military uniform, started using a suit with a tie with a pearl. Okay, and after he lost the plebiscite, went back to his all his stuff, his uniform and all his awards and all that. So there would be a plebiscite on October 5th, 1988, yes or no, for an 8-year term for a president. Didn't specify it was civilian, military, or whatever. A year later, there would be elections for the president and Congress, finally. March, Congress would reopen in Valparaiso, and the new president would take office, right? And then Pinochet, according to his constitution, would remain in command of the army for another 8 years, okay? So, and after that, he would become senator for life. So he basically secured himself immunity from prosecution forever, because first he was like head of state, then he was, former commander-in-chief, and then he was senator, So, and he was commander-in-chief and then senator. So if there was any intention of prosecuting him for anything, there would have to be a very intricate process of lifting his immunity, which actually happened many years later. But this was like the what do you call the straitjackets, okay, that the civilian government had to face. So what happened in this plebiscite is that it's a long story, but it was actually a democratic electoral process, which was very surprising because there had been no democratic elections. But there were new electoral registers. There was a very solid opposition that was united in observing and monitoring this vote. They had it and financed a lot by, foreign funds, including the United States, which helped it, set up this monitoring station for the plebiscite results. They had, what do you call them, like observers at each table, voting booth. It was all manual, but it was pretty efficient. And there were really no allegations of fraud, or at least nothing really relevant. And there were international observers. I mean, tons of people came in. And it was actually a pretty clean, orderly election. And it was clear that the no had won, which meant no to Pinochet for another 8 years. It wasn't a choice between candidates. It was just Pinochet or not Pinochet, okay? Because the election would come later. So what Pinochet wanted to do, and this is all very well documented, and there's like testimony from direct participants, is that night he refused, of course, to concede that he had lost the plebiscite. So his plan was to wreak havoc on the streets, just create artificial violence. And that would allow him to impose a state of siege, which would allow the military to control, that would enable him to annul the election, and that was it. But the whole plan was foiled because, for one, there was backstage on all this. So he was getting pressure from the United States under Reagan, which had finally switched because he was a liability more than an asset now in Latin America, even though Reagan always supported, the Republicans always supported the coup, the military. But by then he was just much more of a liability, so they kind of let him go. They actually appointed a new ambassador, Harry Barnes, to Chile, who was, a career diplomat, and he was basically the liaison with the opposition, the civilian opposition. And so there was back-channel pressure, but also there wasn't consensus among the armed forces about, this defeat. So what happened is that he convened, Pinochet, the night of the plebiscite, he convened the other commanders-in-chief to the presidential palace to lay out this plan, but they didn't go for it. But before that, as they were going in the palace, there was like tons of press, international press, national journalists, and the Air Force commander-in-chief just like turned around and he says, it's pretty clear that the no won. So that completely messed up his plan. And then, in that meeting, there was, and it's very well documented because there was some informant from the military that was reporting to the State Department, like almost minute by minute. And this is all in declassified documents. So the US government knew exactly what was going on like that night. That's what I'm saying, it's very documented. So basically the whole plan failed and he was forced to admit defeat. So the following day, of course, military uniform again. And very harsh stance, not the nice little grandfather that he was during the campaign. So what happened, these elections took place. The opposition won with a moderate Christian Democrat, Elwin, Patricio Elwin was the name of the first civilian government. There were constitutional reforms in 1989, which shortened the first presidential term to 4 years instead of 6, as the Constitution said. But it worked. It pretty much worked out as the timetable set by the Constitution had established. And I just put this little picture just to show how far we've gone from this kind of cabinet in 1990 to this one in 2022, which is a lot more diverse and colorful. Our government spokeswoman in shorts, she actually lives a block away from me and has no guards or anything, yeah. Anyways, that's Elwin, you probably can't see him, but that's Elwin, those are all his male ministers, okay? That's just like an aside, all right? So what this meant was basically we had a very, what they call protected democracy. Or you could call it, a limited democracy or, not a real democracy. A lot of people said this isn't a real democracy. And people were still like kind of upset that the government was still respecting the Constitution because there was part of the society said, okay, so we won the elections, we're in power now, let's just get rid of the Constitution. Why do we have to continue to abide by But those were the rules of the game. And if you see it in retrospect, it may seem ridiculous, but back then there was a very real sense of fear, of the military acting again, or instability, or violence. And it was very real. And there are a lot of documents, internal documents of the government. Patricio Aylwin did an interesting thing. He donated all his archives to a university, first to his foundation, then they were donated to a private university, and they digitalized them, and they're all online. And so you can see all these analysis reports of what the government was analyzing, the relationship with the military, how far they could go on this and that, what to do about, intelligence agents, what to do about human rights. and in those archives, there's like permanent complaints by Pinochet as commander-in-chief of the army, like sending letters to Aylwin all the time saying, I don't like your Minister of Defense, Patricio Rojas, he said this, and that's not true, or get rid of this guy, or I'm mad about this. And this is all like his letters. And then Christmas time, oh, we wish you a very happy Christmas. So it's really interesting because you can, a lot of people in Chile don't even know a lot of these archives exist, but you can really create a nice story out of them. But anyway, so these were the major reforms that the government wanted to enact. And part of them, meant taking out all these authoritarian enclaves out of the Constitution, changing the electoral system, which happened in 2015. This is 1990. And to designated senators, which also was kind of it was part of a constitutional reform in 2005. I'm giving you, I'm jumping to the future because this is how long it took. But for example, some of the non-elected senators would also be former presidents. But when Aylwin stepped down and he had a right to be a senator, he said no. And then Frey came and he said no. So that was gone. That was the end of it. A major judicial reform, which happened much later. There was partial reforms. Elections of mayors and leaders of neighborhood associations like Junta de Vecinos and other authorities, other officials, because Chile after the coup was completely militarized. So it's not just the military regime and the military junta, it was like all of society. University deans were military. Mayors were non-elected, sometimes military, sometimes civilians, but they're not elected. They put their people in the juntas de vecinos, which are the local neighborhood associations. Everything was militarized. So, this took a really long time, the election of mayors, a really long time. And then we had elections of regional governors, which were also appointed. And we started doing that like 3 years ago. This is how long all of this has been taking. Eliminate this, because part of the Constitution said you can't be a social leader and belong to a party at the same time. So they wanted to eliminate that. Some of that did. Freedom of political prisoners. There was about 400 political prisoners still in jail at the time of the end of dictatorship, most of them for violent actions, which were framed in trying to overthrow the dictatorship. So there was a lot of discussion because this had meant also kidnappings and killings, by the people who were in jail. But they were also political prisoners, and they had a right to rebel. So there's this whole discussion of how legitimate their actions were or were not. So there was never any consensus of what to do about them. That's why it took so long, 4 years, to actually have them all get out of jail. And the last ones, they were the ones who attempted to kill Pinochet in 1986. This group of prisoners were the last ones, and their sentence was exchanged for exile, which they called, Cristian, extrañamiento. This very weird figure. This is the man who knows about the transition, probably better than any of us. But extrañamiento, which is really exile. And these guys still live in Finland, Belgium, which were the countries that were willing to bring them in. And their kids had kids, and they married, and they're still there, and they can't come back, because some of these had like a 40-year sentence or life sentence. So a lot of these people who are in Finland or Belgium, and I think those were the main countries, I don't remember, they generally stayed. Some have come back, but they've generally stayed. And of course, truth, justice, and reparation for human rights violations, which is a long process we'll talk about, and dissolution of the Secret Intelligence Agency, CNI, which was the second major secret intelligence agency after DINA. DINA was the first one, set up in 1974. It had to disband in 1977 and, changed. The head of DINA, Manuel Contreras, was forced to resign for something we'll talk about. And then there was another intelligence chief, and then it changed name to CNI. So what happened with these CNI guys is that they were still in the army, in the intelligence department of the army, because the CNI, right at the very end of dictatorship, it was disbanded. But all these people went into the Army Intelligence Department, okay? So what to do about them? So there was also a discussion in these archives. It's so interesting. Well, but I'm going to get into detail about that later. So this all took tons of time. And meanwhile, there was a constitutional reform a year after the plebiscite and before Elwin took office. But it didn't really touch the main authoritarian enclaves. It allowed for other things, improvements, but not the main things. And the main reforms, as I mentioned before, came in 2005, in which all these enclaves were eliminated, and Pinochet's signature was taken out, and President Ricardo Lagos' signature is on our current constitution. So, I mean, the constitutional process is a whole other story that we're still dealing with. Probably some of you may know. We can get into that later, maybe or not, but but this is the constitution we still have. So it's gone through major reforms. Pinochet's signature isn't on it, but in origin, it's still illegitimate, and it was approved fraudulently. So, is it legitimate? Is it not? Because it's been so changed. So a lot of people, like in today's constitutional process, say, well, why bother with a new constitution? Because this isn't really Pinochet's constitution anymore. But it really is, and whatever. But it does have a kind of view of society and the role of the state that most people voted to change. That's why we needed a new constitution. And as I said, changing the electoral system took another 25 years, quarter of a century, and we're talking about like portions of centuries now. So what to do about human rights? This was the first major thorn and problem because there was a really strong demand from human rights organizations and victims' relatives, of course, demanding full justice, accountability and reparation. Reparation, I think it was the last priority. The first thing was like truth, full truth, and justice, which meant, putting people in jail. But I mean, 1990, this was pretty much impossible. But it talked about, solving the problem and how to deal with the amnesty law and the use of a statute of limitations and the constant transfer of human rights cases from civilian courts to the military justice system, which would basically dump them in a black hole and they would be closed, or just like nothing would happen ever. There would be no investigation. So there was never a real power in Congress to eliminate the amnesty law. And as of the year 2000, it's no longer applied. But it's still in effect. I mean, it still exists there, okay? Which is something like legislators, I think they haven't bothered to have time to do, just like 150 secret laws that the dictatorship enacted, which are still in effect. I mean, some of them, for example, are the ones that created DINA. Others are the ones that transferred funds to the military or the commander-in-chief, things that are no longer going on, but they're still there. I mean, they are still there. The amnesty law is still there. And at first it was like, okay, we have to get rid of it. And then when the courts stopped applying it, it just kind of was lost in space, okay? So, but the problem is what to do with the investigations, Partial justice, amnesty, because many of the courts were receiving human rights cases, opening them, just taking a couple of testimonies, and they would amnesty and close them without a full investigation. So part of the discussion, we have to demand a full investigation. If you're going to amnesty, you have to know who you're going to amnesty, right? You can't just have a general amnesty of whoever may be responsible. And we needed truth above all as well. So should we investigate, then amnesty? Should we not do anything at all and leave it to the courts? The government really had no way of forcing the judicial power to do anything. They would be like political gestures. They could be, back channel conversations, but they couldn't really force a judicial power that was still loyal to Pinochet to do anything. There were all sorts of judges, of course. The Supreme Court were basically Pinochet loyalists because he had put them there. And the appeals court, there was a mix, but the lower courts, there were all sorts of judges, right? But most of them had their career during dictatorship as well, so they were taking care of their jobs as well. But there were very many courageous judges who went really far, identified perpetrators, and then they were forced to amnesty, or the military justice system said, we want these cases transferred to us, and they were forced to transfer them, and then they were closed. Okay, so there was a little bit of everything in these courts. Also in discussion was, maybe we could, come to an agreement to exchange information for partial, is it raining? Yes. For partial, partial amnesty, have the military provide information, and then they could be immune or, reduce sentences or something like that. And justice for only a handful of high-profile cases. This was also a controversial issue because they were very high-profile cases, which I would say were like half a dozen, because the victims were high-profile or because they were so outrageous. And,
I'm so sorry, but it's a little bit harder to hear.
Okay. Do you have a microphone? No?
We don't have.
No?
No, we don't.
Okay, so I'll shout. All right. So the thing with they call these high-profile cases, they call them emblematic cases. So they were, high-profile victims, or because they were so outrageous that they were being handled by appeals court judges, not the lower court judges. So they had their special status. So a lot of this discussion was, okay, we need to achieve justice for those cases, and whatever we can do with the other ones, but mainly these ones, and at least they would serve as symbolic justice in general, which of course, family members were like, why is my, husband's death less important than yours? I mean, but this was the language at the time, okay? So what to do about the emblematic cases, they called. And the other thing is kind of what they had to do is just let the courts resolve. But the government was able to intervene somewhat, okay? Because the government was always in this, as I said, kind of a straitjacket, and always trying to balance needs, and demands. And one of them was basically stability versus reform, or stability versus, human rights investigations, or democratic reforms, and stability, military subordination versus justice, because it was really, it didn't have effective authority over the military. In paper, maybe, but it really, I mean, the army especially did whatever it wanted, really. And Pinochet was commander-in-chief of the army, so there was really no way to make the army do anything. Truth versus justice, which was also a discussion. What is more important? Family members wanted both, but what is attainable? That was the thing. What is attainable without getting the military mad, basically, okay? Because, as I said, there was real fear. Could there be, another uprising? Could they do something? And they did, The military acted out twice. So basically, the government took like a middle-of-the-road approach, which was Elwin's famous phrase that he was very criticized for, which was justice insofar as possible, okay? Which was, there was a reason for that, too. I mean, he had the government had a lot of restraints. It was very difficult to really attain full justice. But it was also his way, or the government's way, to, to basically have peace with everyone, They couldn't upset the human rights movements or the organizations because they were like major players back then, not now, not years later, but back then they were like major players. Like the Catholic Church, we talked about in the class recently. The Catholic Church was also a major player. The army was a major player. And they couldn't, go against the relatives or the church that had created this human rights organization, the most important one of them all. And they couldn't fully go against the military. So this is an excerpt from, my translation of what Elwin said in an interview about his famous phrase that he was very criticized for. He said it was a viable path because there were judicial investigations underway, but not a beheading nor an aggressive action against those who still had the power of weapons. Okay? So we're not going to go full-fledged against the military, but we'll do what we can through judicial investigations. And he kind of left it up to the courts with political signs, okay? But we will get to something really important that was done that allowed investigations to go forward and eventually allowed for a lot of convictions to this day, okay? But that was his position. He was very criticized for that, but that's the way it was. But one of the things the government did almost immediately was to create a commission to hear the testimonies, collect testimonies from the families of those who had been killed or had disappeared during dictatorship. Not the other abuses, for now. There was another commission in 2004 to collect testimonies from people who had suffered political prison and torture. But this is just executions and disappearances. And it was called the Reti Commission because the lawyer who was kind of presiding over the commission was Raúl Reti. That was his last name. So this report was issued in 1991. It was convened in 1990. In January 1991, the commission gave the report to Elwin. He took it on vacation. There were 4 volumes, and he read it all. And then in March, he basically, gave a speech to the nation, asked for forgiveness, and on behalf of the state, to the victims and their families. And one really important thing that the Reti Commission did that I think a lot of people just kind of, they didn't pay much attention to it maybe, is that when it collected evidence or information that could contribute to judicial cases, it transferred them to the courts. So there were hundreds and hundreds of human rights cases that were reopened because they had been closed during dictatorship, or opened based on new evidence provided by these testimonies. But back then it was like, okay, but how far can we really, there wasn't really much expectation that they would get very far. But this was a really important thing for what happened that year and the following years, okay? And not only was it like the official report on the number of executions and disappearances and how they took place and how they were systematic, but also it provided reparation compensation to the families. For example, monetary. They would have, compensation in terms of funds, free university tuition for their children, the victims' children, a special program called PRAIS, which was medical and psychological treatment for victims and their families, free. It was part of the public system. The children of victims were not obligated to do military service, okay? So those are some of the compensations that were kind of repeated also for the torture victims more than a decade later. And another issue was, what to do with these guys. This was the DINA logo, Dirección de Inteligencia Nacional. These are actual agents, okay? Dressed as civilians. So most of them were transferred to Army intelligence, right? So Elwin's plan, and this is all in these archives, Elwin's plan was to phase them out, a gradual kind of bulk by bulk, taking them out of the military, of the army. And there was a discussion in these files about, should we give them seed money to create small businesses? It's not, I'm not joking. I saw that document, I read it. It was part of because there was a lot of differences within the government, what to do about this, what to do about human rights. It wasn't, uniform. So part of this discussion was like, at least let them do something. So probably we should give them, initial seed funds to create a business. Well, of course, that didn't happen, right? And then the objective was to have them all out of the army by the time Elwin finished his term in 1994. Didn't happen. Many stayed on. Some until very recently. We just had this investigative report 2 weeks ago about at least 9 officers in different branches of the armed forces that were still in active service or had been rehired as well by those military services. There are a lot of security guards and cab drivers. It's impressive. It really is. When you take a cab and these guys start talking, you realize what they're about. But also security guards, that's their specialty, And what's also kind of scary is that most of the civilians who collaborated, we don't know who they are. And doctors, a lot of doctors. A lot of them from the military hospital, but others that weren't. And so torture victims, I've talked to torture victims, one said, I always saw the hands of because the doctors would what would you call them? bring them to life if they were almost dying under torture, or, or see, how their heart was doing and how much more torture they could endure, that kind of thing. So one woman said, for example, I was always able to see under my blindfold the hands of the doctor. So anytime I go to a doctor now, I try to find women doctors. And anytime I have a male doctor, I have to look at his hands. Or someone who said, I always saw their feet. So like, looking at the street of all men's feet, which is kind of ridiculous. But those are the kind of traumas that exist to this day. So they're doctors, and actually there's one who's a heart specialist in a private clinic, Manuela Morlillo, that everyone knows. He was a torturer. And he's still a heart specialist in this private clinic. And that's it, and he should have been prosecuted and wasn't, I don't know why. And he's, so there are still doctors in practice who participated in torture. And civilians, there were reservists, there were university students, like in the National Stadium, which is one of the main concentration centers right after the coup. There were a group of Catholic university students torturing, and they just went back to their normal lives and became successful business people and all that. And this is all documented. I'm not inventing any of this stuff up, okay? So anyway, so that's what happened with, and just like an aside, is that while all this was happening with CNI, DINA, they were also destroying their files, not all of them, but they did eliminate a lot. Right at the end of dictatorship, the junta issued a decree allowing for the elimination of the archives of the Armed Forces and the Defense Ministry, if they wanted to do so, instead of sending them every 5 years to the National Archive as the rest of the administration has to do. So they started, burning like crazy, but they burned before, they burned after. Then in 1977, they started to microfilm a lot of the archives that CNI received from DINA. And in the year 2000, they took them to an incinerator and burned them. Yeah. And now these guys have been indicted, these officers from the year 2000 who burned these archives. But not all the archives are missing, and we'll get to that. They say they don't have anything, but that's not true. And the other important thing that came out of kind of the Reddick Commission, but also the fact that all these cases were being reopened, is that, and the fact that the civilian government was only able to intervene the detective force and not the Carabineros police, okay? Which the detectives are the ones who investigate the crimes. Carabineros is more like, police prevention and repression and all that. And the Carabineros police was never really intervened or reformed to this day, really. That's why in 2019, with all the protests, they continued to act as they did in the past, and they continued with human rights violations. But they did intervene the investigations force. And so Elwin was able to, because back then, the only people who could direct the investigations police was either an army general or someone from the detective force. But the government had no one trustworthy within the detective force. So they brought in this army general who had opposed the dictatorship after supporting it a few years. And he was head of the force. And he had by then surrounded himself by advisors from the human rights community. Like his advisor on intelligence was a journalist in the opposition magazine Análisis. Andrés Domínguez was his advisor on educational reform for the detectives. He came from the Human Rights Commission. There was, Rodrigo Arragaitia, I can never pronounce his name. He was also a journalist. He was also one of the advisors. So Toro, this man, came in with a lot of human rights people as his closest advisors. And he came cracking down right away. So he, the high command that really opposed him got him out right away. A new high command, out. So he, rose, promoted a lot of officers, and he reformed the entire training program for these detectives, and he started weeding out all these corrupt officers, but not necessarily those officers who had gone to DINA and CNI, because they had been sent on commission. So basically they were fulfilling their duties. I mean, legally, technically, they couldn't be, public office is really hard to fire someone. They couldn't be ousted because they were corrupt, or because they sold drugs, or took money, or accepted bribes, but not because they were part of DINA, for example. But they did phase them out generally, and Toro created this very, very tiny unit within the Internal Affairs Department to investigate all these new cases that were popping up in the courts. There were 2 officers at first, then became bigger. And the government really gave it a lot of resources gradually, because it was a very poor police force. But they, got more and more resources, and from its original mission of like analyzing what the detectives in different parts of the country were filing as police reports for human rights investigations, they started to be more operative, and they started going after the agents, and they started mapping out the whole intelligence, and they started going abroad to find agents and bring them back, okay? So they continued, they had very fast growth, and basically were the ones who were able to amass all the information, evidence needed for prosecution, but that didn't happen until after except a few cases, for another 10 years. But they did do all this groundwork, and people really didn't know much about that was going on. Because no one really knew much about the detective force because everyone was concentrated on the military and the police, okay? He also, put a really big dose of human rights training among the force. And this unit that he created, which was continued by his successor, Nelson Meri, who was actually a career detective, the first one. He stayed on for 10 years. And this intelligence agency, this special unit within the Internal Affairs Department was not seen positively within the institution, which was still mainly loyal to Pinochet. And Toro, the first director, one of the first tasks of this unit was like, investigate your colleagues. It's a hard thing to do. So investigate which detectives were also involved in crimes, and they had to, and they were young guys. These were very young guys, and they had to like interrogate, what they call interview, but they had to interrogate their own, these DINA officers and CNI officers that were there, on commission. So they started gathering all this evidence. This is just a reference photo because this is actually from the year 2005. This is Manuel Contreras, the head of DINA. He was arrested twice, and the last time was in 2005, and he never left prison ever again until he died. So while all of this was going on, this is kind of the schizophrenia of the transition. So while all of this was going on and the government was giving them resources to go to Paraguay and find agents, go to Brazil and bring back this notorious torture, go to Argentina and find this other agent that was hiding there because the Army Intelligence Department had been sending some of the agents that were most vulnerable, mainly civilians, to other countries because the civilians were always the weak spot. So these detectives, their strategy was, let's go for the weak spot, the civilians, who are not under control of the military and they're more vulnerable. They don't have the same discipline. And for example, one of them, Romo, which is this disgusting torturer who was hiding out in Brazil since 1975, because he was such a liability, because he was like blabbed off, and he was very like mentally unstable, and he would like brag about what he did. And he actually had prisoners look at him. He took off the, I'm Osvaldo Romo. He was like so proud of what he was doing, so prisoners could identify him. So he was brought back, and there was a lot of cross-examination in the courts and the families. Political prisoners and families had to go and and face these guys in court, which was really horrible. So, but these guys were being indicted for human rights crimes, and they and another civilian agent, they provided so much information on the workings of these agencies that allowed them to go even further, and eventually got the heads of DINA indicted, but it kind of didn't matter because they were all amnestied, closed. So real justice didn't begin for a long time. And in the meantime, the government was like, what to do with a human rights problem? Because Elwin wanted to like solve this by the end of his term, and it was impossible because there's no way to artificially close an issue, an open wound without truth and justice. And but politically, they wanted to like kind of clear the scene, just like kind of hand over the government cleansed in some way. But it was impossible, so they juggled several bills in Congress. that would, for example, exchange information for impunity, or there was a new partial amnesty law, and it was like a scandal. So they all failed because of immediate protest and because human rights organizations said no way. And the government at least respected that, This is Pinochet. Finally, we're talking 8 years later, he finally steps down as commander-in-chief of the army, becomes senator for life, again the Pearl, and and this is his first day in Congress, in Senate, and so all these senators were, holding pictures of people who had disappeared. And there was like fighting and all that. It was a huge scandal, and I really don't know how often he went to Congress. I don't know really if this was his only day or not, but not very much. I don't think he did much. But he did step down finally. He became a senator with immunity and all that, and that meant that he gave the government, the names of 5 officers who could succeed him. The government chose the youngest one, which meant, at least a lot of loyal Pinochet officers would have to go into retirement. That happened in 1998. Months before, the Communist Party had done something considered pretty symbolic, which was to file the first criminal lawsuit against Pinochet, directed against Pinochet. Because usually these lawsuits for human rights cases were worded in that, this is like against whoever may be responsible, because they didn't know who was responsible, right? Who the perpetrators were. But this was case like specifically against Pinochet, because there was evidence that he had ordered this campaign called the Death Caravan, which was he sent a delegation to many cities, north and south, and basically had a lot of political prisoners executed. So this was for like more than 70 victims of the Death Caravan, and there was evidence that he had ordered it. So this was directly, but everyone's like, right, So this was more symbolic. It wasn't reported much in the press. It was just like, small, brief notice. Because no one thought it would come to much, but it actually did. And then, then this happened, and this changed everything. And Pinochet was arrested in London, where he went on a diplomatic passport on an official mission, and he had back problems, so he didn't trust Chilean doctors, even though I think some of his advisors said, you have to have surgery here. I mean, because there was growing momentum, and his advisors feared that he could actually, face some sort of problem. Pinochet felt so, immune from everything that he went anyways. He had surgery, and the Spanish judge found out that he was in London, and there were a couple Spanish judges investigating crimes against its citizens in Chile, and in Argentina, and got one of them to issue an international arrest warrant against Pinochet and asked for his extradition to be tried in Spain. So, the British police went to the London clinic where he was recovering from surgery and had him arrested. And then, he had to spend some time there recovering, and then he was sent to different homes. The last one was like this huge mansion that a lot of people in Britain and in Chile financed, and the army financed. There was like a collect, for our leader. So there was a lot of money coming from Chile also to finance him. A lot of officers went to show their support. A lot of the right wing also went, because the right wing parties that were later government in like 2010, Piñera and all that, they were like born politically during the dictatorship, the end of the dictatorship. And they were loyal to Pinochet. And even though years later they would distance themselves and didn't want to get involved, we still have pictures of all of them hugging him in London. So they all went, and he was really big buddies with Margaret Thatcher. The army had bought a lot of weapons from Great Britain. It was one of its main providers, so he had a really good relationship with the British. So he was arrested, and he was arrested for like 503 days, okay, a long time. And in that time, there was this like back and forth about lifting his immunity as former head of state, and some said he's not former head of state because he was a dictator, and then finally they lifted immunity. But in the end, and this was like a major political thing in Chile. I mean, like every time the House of Lords was going to vote anything or any decision in Britain, like people were on the streets waiting for the decision, either to celebrate or or whatever. It was a fun time, but I went like I had to cover like the right, the Pinochet Foundation. There was a Pinochet Foundation. So I had to cover that event as the Lords were voting. And when they lost, it was like they lifted his immunity only for a few cases of torture after 1988. But the people in the foundation didn't really understand, so they thought that since they said, you know, we will not lift his immunity to prosecute him for all the crimes that Spain is saying, and it was like, ah! And then, but all the cases after 1988, and so they like became enraged and went after the press, because, you know, we're all communist. All the international press is communist. So they really, I mean, they're violent people. They're aggressive people. You know, and everyone celebrates and all that. It was really fun, actually. But anyway, so he was never actually sent to Spain, because eventually, well, the Chilean government, from almost the beginning, with a lot of internal conflict, wanted him sent home. Whereas everyone, not everyone, but a lot of people said, no, you have to send him to Spain because he's never going to be tried here, because he never has been. So let's have Spain do it. But you know, the Frey government, Elwin was gone. It was another Christian Democratic Frey, and maybe, I don't know if Christian, you will not like this, but Frey really never paid any attention to human rights, really. He was one of the presidents who never received human rights organizations in the presidential palace. Like, he would never invite them over, he never listened to them. He really couldn't care less. His thing was economy, trade agreements, Asia, that was his thing. So this was like really a thorn on his side. In fact, his father had been killed, you know, but who was a former president too. But he didn't believe that either, so he never paid attention. So Frey was like, we need him back, and we promised to try him in Chile, okay? So that was the promise, and the Brits, you know, after Pinochet's defense said, oh, he's like ailing, he's almost dying, and, you know, they had medical and psychological exams, and they, you know, sent the Home Office, you know, these very like tragic, dramatic health reports that he was about to die. So finally they sent him home, and of course he didn't, and he actually was fine for quite a while. You know, he jumped out of his wheelchair as soon as he got here and started, you know, hugging everyone. It was crazy. But Frey did want to do that, and what happened is that they had to fulfill their promise. So there were several effects and contexts here. By this time, I mean, the fact that someone had arrested Pinochet was a psychological victory. This is like, okay, I mean, he's not untouchable. He was always kind of, you know, Contreras was even, the DINA chief, was touchable, but not Pinochet, but he finally was, you know, someone was. So he wasn't this like completely powerful person that you couldn't touch anymore. By the time that he came back, there were hundreds of cases against him, from the sole case filed by the Communist Party months before. Everyone said, okay, he's touchable now. So everyone filed suit. There were like 330 when he got back, waiting for him, okay? Another really important effect was this agreement to hold a dialogue between the army and the government, with the participation of some human rights lawyers and organizations and, like, you know, public respected figures. It was called Mesa de Diálogo. And the army promised to provide information on the disappeared. That was their contribution, okay? But it wasn't a something charitable or something that they really wanted to do out of their goodwill, but because the new commander-in-chief of the army said, just like family members want to find their loved ones, we want to stop the unending parade of our officers in court. Because the courts were full of officers going to testify, cross-examination, and these were some were retired, many were in active service, and the military was very angry that, you know, the officers were constantly going in court. There were two events that I hadn't mentioned, but in 1990 and 1993, Pinochet did have his little bout of show of force, you know, any troops to the streets. Another time, you know, troops surrounding the army building, which is right in front of the presidential palace, as a show of force, you know, against the government. This is kind of, you know, we're still here, we're still around. When this unending parade started, but also in conjunction with an investigation into one of his sons, a very rogue son, also called Augusto, for corruption, okay? In this case, after the second show of force was finally dropped. But part of the, I interviewed like the interior minister at the time. He says, you know, the excuse was always the, you know, his son's corruption case. But basically the demands they wanted, because they negotiated with Pinochet's liaison, you know, and he said basically what they wanted was, you know, to stop this parade of officers through the courts. So the way to do this was to bring evidence to the courts that the disappeared had actually been killed. Because some judges, as a way to bypass the amnesty law, they started saying that kidnappings and disappearances were acts of permanent, no, the disappearance was an act of permanent kidnapping. And as such, it continued to the present day. So you couldn't apply a statute of limitations. It wasn't covered by the amnesty law that only went to 1978. This is a way to bypass this, right? So the way judges were doing this, they were still like indicting people because these were permanent kidnappings. So the only thing the army had to do was say, we'll confirm that we actually did kill them, which was also an important admission of guilt that they had participated in killings, which they hadn't done before. But what happened is that they, we'll get to it, but they provided a lot of information on 200 cases, and most of it was false, okay? Because judicial investigations were opened based on that, and it ended up that some of the remains were found buried and not at sea, as they had said. So a lot of it was false, but not all of it. And then there was a really important side effect, which was the beginning of the United States government's declassification program on Chile. Because European countries, you know, with Pinochet arrested in London, also sought his extradition for crimes against their own citizens, and they were opening investigations in their own countries. And they said, hey, United States, you know, you have victims. They said, no, not us, but we'll contribute with what we have. So in 1999, as Pinochet was in prison, this is Clinton, they started a declassification program, and I think the first things they declassified was all the information on United States victims, Horman and Tarugi and Boris Weisweiler, the three United States citizens who were killed. Boris was disappeared. Stuff on the Letelier case. And originally it was about the coup and the dictatorship. And they ended up, they said, oh, there was Peter Kornbluh told me all this. There's like this, he was behind all this lobbying and moved to get all these things classified, declassified. So he said there was a lot of discussion about, you know, where if we're going to declassify all this information on the dictatorship, we should also declassify our information on the Allende government to prove, you know, all the horrible things that Allende did. And what ended up happening is that they declassified tons of evidence about how the United States had intervened to, you know, avoid Allende's assumption to the presidency, and how, you know, all the campaigns they did against the Allende government. There isn't like really direct evidence of US involvement in the coup, the day of the coup, but everything else, you know. So they ended up revealing much more than they thought. And so for Chileans, it was a huge thing because we had documented history about, you know, what the US was doing, but also a lot of the discussion among Chileans and things that were happening in Chile that we didn't know about, that, you know, the ambassador was reporting, the CIA was reporting, or the defense ministry was reporting. So we had a very full knowledge of everything that was going on. US intervention, I'm not going to get into it because it's like another hour, and yesterday I spoke like twice as long as I should have. But I do want to say that this was very important even for judicial cases, because they're documents from the time, so it's not as if they were adapted for, you know, consumption in 1999 or the major declassification in 2000. But they did serve to contribute effectively. They're public domain. You can download all of them from the State Department site. And actually, it could be an interesting project for students also to, you know, check out what's in the State Department website about U.S. intervention in Chile. And it's part of our, you know, historical record now. These documents, just a little parentheses, these documents were handed over physically to the Chilean government, I think in 2001. And I remember vividly, because I was reporting on this all the time, that the government promised that they would all be translated into Spanish, classified, and be available for the public. So they were never translated. They spent many, many years laying around in boxes in the National Archive. And as far as I know now, they are also laying around in boxes in the Library of Congress in Santiago. But they weren't translated, they weren't classified, they're not open to the public, they're just laying around. But you can see them all online, but Chileans, don't necessarily read English, so the point was that, they would be able to access everything. But there's been like books on this, a lot of, reports. I mean, there's tons of information out there. So this is actually when Pinochet came back. He was just taken out of the plane that brought him home, stood up immediately to hug Isurrieta, the new commander-in-chief, walked over to the helicopter that was going to take him somewhere or another, laughing and lifting his cane. He was fine, he was old, but he was fine. But, Chile had to keep its part of the deal to try him, and now there were over 300 lawsuits that enabled, investigations to move forward. And what was happening in this year, this was a very critical period, because in 1998, not only did he step down and all that, but there was a change in the judicial power itself, because there was not the overall judicial reform that there was in 2005. I don't really remember, but not the overall reform that made our system now like a public trial system. These were very secretive investigations handled by one judge. But there were some reforms that, for example, put an age limit to judges in the Supreme Court. So that meant that a lot of them had to go home, because they were very old. So a lot of them went home, so there were newer judges, new generation of judges. And also, Chile had signed the Rome Statute that created the International Criminal Court. So it was like accepting, universal justice for crimes against humanity. They started talking about crimes against humanity as systematic, abuses, and not just rogue elements or just like individual crimes, but something that was systematic, that's not subject to amnesty or statute of limitations. So they were changing their own, the judges, their own perspective. And the Supreme Court was also ceasing to apply the amnesty law. So this is the time when the amnesty law was kind of put aside and never really used again. And Isurrieta, the new commander-in-chief, was young, as I said, and his mission was to distance the army from the Pinochet legacy and basically return it to its non-political role in society, which is pretty much what has happened, okay? The military, is being investigated for huge corruption cases, but they're not political actors anymore, okay? So that was the context then. And the dialogue that I mentioned before, as I said, much of it was false. They provided information on 200 people out of the 1,000 and more who had disappeared. They said most of them, 122, were thrown into the ocean, 21 in rivers and lakes, and 20 of them, they didn't have any identification, so they had no idea where they went. And I don't know why there's a number of 200 and not 1,100, I don't know why. But anyway, so they turned that over, and the government in turn gave that information to the courts that allowed the Supreme Court to to have judges appointed for exclusive investigation of these cases, and over 50 with priority investigation of human rights cases. And that's when they discovered that much of the information was false. Because saying they were all dumped into the sea is so we are saying we are responsible for throwing these people into the sea, but you can't find them, but we are confirming that they were killed. So it's not permanent kidnapping anymore, all right? But they did find, in 2 cases, the information was correct. And in one of them, Cuesta Barriga, which is a military area, kind of a hilly military area, they found bone fragments, remains, and that were identified 10 years later. But they did find them, but the military didn't say, there are people in Cuesta Barriga in this specific geographic spot. They gave them coordinates, okay? So they had to figure out the family members who were there on site first, looking at Cuesta Barriga, which is a huge place, trying to figure out with the help of geographers what these coordinates meant. So they spent a week looking in the wrong place, and then forensics and detectives went in and they finally found the place and found the remains of a lot of people, but bone fragments, not full remains. Because in 1978, as of 1978, Pinochet had the military exhume all the people they had buried illegally, who were disappeared, and dispose of them permanently, because they didn't want any evidence lying around. So basically they did throw them in the ocean, or they exploded them, or they incinerated them. So what was being found now are just bits and fragments, not full bodies. I think I have to pick up pace, right? So yeah. So these human rights investigations right now, the first major convictions were in 1994, but that was linked to the death of the execution of 3 communists, and linked to a special unit in the Carabineros police. But the major case was the Letelier investigation. He was the former ambassador to the United States during the Allende government, former defense minister, former foreign minister. He had been imprisoned and tortured and exiled, and he ended up in exile in the United States in Washington, D.C., where he was the main opposition leader in exile. And so he was a target. And Pinochet had Dina kill him in a car bomb attack on Embassy Row in Washington, D.C., which was a huge trauma. And for the United States, it was unheard of, The FBI started investigating, and just like months later got to Dina. They immediately figured out it was Dina. This is because its relation with the United States and all that, this was the only case exempt from the amnesty law. So this was an investigation that could continue, and that ended up in 1995 with the arrest of the 2 Dina agents, main ones, well, and other ones, but these guys. And since in 1993, there were already the first convictions that were going to appeal, but the government already knew this was coming, so they started setting up a special jail for human rights violators, Punta Peuco, which is that one, which is now at its full capacity. So they were actually sentenced to very few years, so they were actually freed after they're serving their sentence. But then they were arrested for other crimes, and Contreras, had an accumulation of 900 years or something, and he died in prison. And Pedro Espinosa is still alive. He's also had like hundreds of years in sentences, but he's still alive in Punta Peuco. Now there's about 270 people in prison for human rights violations. Half of them are in Punta Peuco, and they can't take more because it's full. And the rest are going to Colina, which is a common prison, And some women are going to women's prisons as well, women like nurses who participated in torture and all that. So finally, just to wrap up Pinochet himself, he was being investigated for corruption, for siphoning off millions of dollars from the state and funds from the military and reserved funds for the commander-in-chief, and putting it in bank accounts all over the world, but also especially in the United States under false names. He had 3 different false passports. So he was investigated in the US Senate, which derived from, after the Twin Towers thing, there was those investigations where they started just like reviewing arbitrarily like bank accounts. And all of a sudden, there's like Pinochet popped up. That's how Chileans found out. That's the only reason Chileans found out. And Chile started investigating him and his wife and his children, froze his assets and all that. So when he died, finally, he had been stripped of immunity because he was still senator, to face 2 big charges on, 2 big crimes, but he was never convicted. He was indicted and not convicted. He was just under house arrest. So when he died, he was being prosecuted for human rights cases and corruption. And his wife died just a few years ago. He died on International Human Rights Day, which is also his wife's birthday. And he was, he kind of lost face with the corruption, because a lot of people were willing to accept crimes as part of a supposed war, but not stealing. Just to bring it more up to date, as I said, 270 officers, approx, are in jail. There's now 17 judges dedicated exclusively to human rights cases. There's 1,500 cases underway. And every day, literally, there is a ruling from the appeals court or the Supreme Court about some human rights case, some conviction, or some appeal. And not just the executed and disappeared, but a lot of torture cases that started coming in. And now they're ruling more and more. These are civilian cases for compensation, but on torture. So these are the kind of cases that are being dealt with. And the problem is this race against time, which is the term biological impunity, which is a term being used a lot now because this means that perpetrators are dying, family members are dying, witnesses are dying. So when all of them are gone, what do you do with the investigations? What do you do with truth, you know? Who are you going to punish as well? And more recently, on August 30th this year, the government announced a national search plan for the remaining 1,469 people who have disappeared or whose remains were not returned to families after execution. Only 307 have been found and identified in all this time. So this plan encompasses, I'm really afraid about the time. So all of this stuff, a lot of it is based on centralizing documentation and archives and cross-referencing them, digitalizing them, buying software, which the government is already doing. I think it already did. Excavating in sites that were leads in judicial investigations, but the judges didn't have the money or the funds to actually excavate. So they were just like things undone. This is a horrible story about 89 boxes, supermarket boxes with remains uncovered in 2001 that since the judge who was excavating in 2001 didn't trust the National Forensic Service because years before it had misidentified almost 50 disappeared, returned the remains to their families, they buried them, and a decade later they had to return the remains for re-identification. So he didn't trust the National Forensics Agency, so he asked the University of Chile to keep these boxes, 89 boxes of remains. A new judge came to investigate just a couple years later and asked the University of the Forensic Service, to get these boxes back. So they called the University of Chile and said, we need those boxes. And the university says, okay, just let us know when you're coming. And no one ever went. No one ever went. So these boxes were 20 years unexamined in supermarket boxes, like detergent and all that, in a university basement. And now they are back in the forensic service, and they're already being sent to foreign labs for identification. Other things that they hope to do is to review the testimony of conscripts that have, since years ago, they were trying to get compensation for the trauma they suffered during their obligatory military service. They had provided testimony, but no one really, since it was about their suffering, I don't know, the interviews didn't go well because they didn't ask specifically about what did you do, what did you see. But these are in file, and no one's really processed them. So that's something. And what's not part of the, which I think is vital, but that's not part of the plan, is to seek agents, low-ranking agents, at home, because they are at home, or driving cabs, I don't know. Because they may have information about not the identity, but at least where they were forced to execute and bury people. So, but that's not part of the plan, unfortunately. But I think, there are detectives, former detectives, and this unit collaborating, and there are lawyers, and I'm sure that's going to happen anyways, because that's going to be, you can't avoid it. You can't avoid it. The obstacles: lack of cooperation from the military and police, as usual. When, as I say, they destroyed a lot of files, but not all of them, because when a judge asks the military to hand over, for example, the list of soldiers who were in this regiment at this time, they hand it over. We want the War Council record file for this prisoner who was executed, and they're supposed to be burned, but they they take them, and you see them in the file. I mean, I've even asked through Freedom of Information Law, war councils that are supposed to have been destroyed, and they send it to me. So all these things are there. A lot of this stuff is around, and it may be around in these officers' homes as well. So that's lack of cooperation, the missing information in files, the operation withdrawal of television sets, which was what the operation was called when they exhumed the bodies and dumped them in the ocean, and biological impunity. And just to end with this, is especially this year, there's been like a trend of denialism, and not just negationism, but like justifying the coup. So there was, these were kind of phrases that we heard. The coup was inevitable. There would not have been a Pinochet without an Allende. So everything's becoming more relative. It's like, well, the crimes happened because Allende was first. And there is like increasing acceptance of the coup and the dictatorship. And I just want to show this survey, just like 3 little slides, and I promise we're done. This is in March of this year. This is knowledge about the coup. So you see the age range. So people over 53, 78% said they know a lot or quite a bit. 36 to 52, 56% says that. But people under 35, only 44% say they really know a lot about it. And almost nothing, 41%. And that's, of course, because we have none of this in schools. Meaning of September 11th. In 2013, 63% of the people surveyed said that the coup destroyed, or September 11th destroyed democracy in Chile. 18% said it had freed Chile from communism. This year, 42% says democracy was destroyed, and 36% said it freed Chile from Marxism. So it dropped from 63 to 42 people, 42% that are basically justifying the coup. And the last one is about the justification, or the question was, was the military right in staging the coup? 2013, 68% said there was never any justification for a coup. This year, 36% said, no, right? It was justified, and 41% there is never any justification. So it went from 68 to 41, okay? So that's what we're dealing with now. And that's part of the discussion throughout this year for the 50-year anniversary commemoration events. And I'll finish right here, okay? So I don't know if there's time for questions or comments.
I'm actually very curious about the missing documents, because I know I've been looking so far just for like government regulations and stuff, and I know the RNAT has a huge gap starting with Alessandri, but then there's like weird stuff throughout the 70s and 80s. But now that I'm moving into different parts of my dissertation, how are you finding the stuff that you're finding, and where are you getting those? I think I'm asking very broad questions for the transparency law, and so I'm getting like, you asked us a question, and here's something that's not related to it. So.
Oh yeah, the transparency law, which is like the freedom of information law equivalent. Yeah, sometimes they'll bypass it by sending you the wrong information, and it's kind of a strategy to just like wear you out, because then you have to ask again, this is not what I wanted. But sometimes they really do send you the information. Like just recently I asked for the information about how many, well actually a few years ago I asked Gendarmeria, which is the prison police, the number and names and sentences for all the people serving sentences for human rights crimes. So they gave me this stupid list which said 1, 2, 3 is numbers, blank, 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 and then it said Punta Peuco, Colina, just where they were, but not the names. They said it was private information. Well, I took that to court, and they finally gave me the full information. This year, I wanted to know the same number of people, and they just gave me the number. Nothing else. But whatever, I just needed it for the story, and I got it. But that's how I got like the 270. But I work with a lot of judicial files, and as long as the case is closed, it's supposed to be public information, even though it's such a secretive judicial system, because human rights cases are still in the old system, not the new trial system. But you usually get them through lawyers, even if they're open, because it's 50 years, So it's like, why am I going to protect someone who did something in 1974? I mean, so I use a lot of them. I really go through them. And that's how you find a lot of the stuff that the army is sending them, It's like, I found like when I was doing my book on the National Stadium, this like precious treasure of, this, I think it was some sort of war council or investigation about a prisoner that they had incorporated into the judicial file. And there was this document signed by the head of the interrogators of the armed forces and police in the National Stadium. So I had his name, and I knew the position existed. And that was part of the file. And just like these little things that you find, I use the archives a lot. I use the Foreign Ministry archives a lot. She mentioned the National Archive, which does have a lot of gaps. Like there was a lot of archive burning also after the coup. Actually, the National Archive, because I take students there, so they do always a display of interesting things, and they always show them this burned, singed copies, not copies, the actual documents that were from the La Moneda presidential palace during the fire. And they're like, burned. But there's a lot of stuff that's missing. Like I want to see all the files, I don't know, September 1973, Interior Ministry or Defense Ministry. There's like nothing there. It's like, send us more paper, more pens and, appointments, but there's really nothing there. But then you find little jewels, like, I don't know, the investigations police has this huge file on how they were spying on the women's movement in the 1940s and 50s, which is fascinating. Now the judge who discovered, tons of files in Colonia Dignidad, turned them over to the National Archive and you can look at them, Human rights organizations, this is why it's also scattered, like the Human Rights Commission, which is one group, has its own files. It donated some to the Memory Museum as part of their documentation center, and it donated part of it to the National Archive. So it's like scattered in 3 different places, I don't know, I work a lot with documents. I go to archives that people usually don't know, like the Elwyn Archive. A lot of people don't even know that exists, Or they don't know that in the foreign ministry you can see, like when I was doing the National Stadium thing, the foreign ministry, it's basically the communications from the Chilean foreign ministry to its embassies abroad, except border countries that we don't have access to, and also with foreign embassies in Santiago. So it's like back and forth. And the juicy things are like the diplomatic notes and the telex, and reserved memos. So the ordinary memos are like useless. But there's all sorts of information there. So if you're talking, investigating like, I don't know, a Brazilian prisoner, you go to the Brazilian fund and there's all this back and forth with telex and diplomatic notes about issues. When, for example, the police was looking for this agent in Paraguay, and I was doing the book on the detectives, it was all there, like the police reports were going through the ministry. So it was all there, So there's lots of things you can do, but it just takes time as well, because you have to sit in an archive. There's a lot of stuff. I mean, I do journalism classes, and I tell them there's a wealth of information online even. Like Congress, there's so much stuff there, but no one really takes the time to go through it, like investigative commissions in Congress. There was an investigative commission on these 89 boxes, okay? And, well, it's been taking forever for the commission to be created, and, the last time I checked, it hadn't even started to session. But when it does, we're gonna have access to all the reports that they ask for, all the memos that they ask for, all the evidence and information that they are going to accumulate to do their job. And that's gonna be online, But people don't, I don't know, they don't know that's available also. But anyway, so there is a lot of archive. And the thing about the microfilm and burning, I found that out because I did that story for the New York Times. And that's how the story broke, actually, because a detective who had been investigating the Frey murder, he said, there's information there about, microfilm and burning of archives, but the judge is investigating the murder and he hasn't had time to follow that lead. But why don't you ask for the statements of this officer, and this? So I went with a list of names. And then I got the actuaria, who's like the secretary of the judge, who are very helpful. And I said, can I have these testimonies? And she gave them to me. And usually when you have judicial statements, they come with their address and their phone and even their email. So you could call all these people up. So I called the Kodak people who microfilmed. I called the agents who burned them. I called the agents who, were microfilming it. And just out of judicial files, So you can do that stuff. Anyway, that's how I find some documents. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you think that I was really struck by the survey data that you put up at the very end. Partly, I guess, because I feel like my own family history has been marked by dictatorships and fascism in a number of different countries. And I'm interested to see that the dramatic differences between 2013 and 2023 is we've had this kind of rise of authoritarianism and the acceptance of it around the world. And I'm wondering how much you think it's tied just to a lack of knowledge and how much this sort of acceptance and justification of fascism?
I think it has a lot to do with lack of information and lack of education, because there are no like education programs in schools or universities that talk about it. So you kind of just depend on what you hear and what your family talks about, if they talk about it, or what you hear from friends. And you know, these are like several generations removed. So they start, you know, they can't see the dimension of the trauma and the violence. You know, it's just like numbers maybe. Oh, so, you know, 1,000 people were killed in, you know, when there's a war, and they talk about war when there was none, that's kind of normal. So a lot of it is that, I think. And because, well, a lot of people now, since like crime is such a huge issue in Chile, they justify, you know, a harder hand against any sort of instability and violence, you know? And I think that's part of it, like this mentality there is now that we need, you know, something a little more authoritarian to curb crime, you know, or justify, you know, a harder hand, or justify sacrificing freedoms. I mean, that's my take. And also because the right wing has been so emboldened by recent voting in the constitutional process the past few years that they're like setting the agenda, and they're setting the issues, you know, in the political agenda. And they have their own take on history as well, you know. And that's what comes out in the media all the time, and that's what they talk about. So that's what's circulating, you know, and families and teachers and people have to like talk about it and, you know, show the other side. But you preach to the choir all the time, not to the people you really, you know, need to teach. I don't know, that's my interpretation. Mm-hmm.
Is this authoritarian shift associated with different changes in the Chilean society, like different sentiments? Or?
Well, I think so, because what I was saying is like generations removed from that trauma. So like younger generations, if their family was affected, they probably know a little more, but if they're not, and the family doesn't talk about it because they're uninformed or they don't care, or because it's part of history, because there's also this very strong, you know, discourse of let history, you know, just let it go. But for a family who has members who have disappeared, it's impossible for them to let it go. So they're far removed. It's not something part of their daily lives or part of their history training or education. It's not part of life, you know, and it's not treated as history. That's the problem. It's not treated as history. It's treated as memory. It's treated as issues, but not like, okay, let's look at, you know, Vietnam War, Second World War, Chilean coup as historical facts. That's the problem, you know. And that's one of the main problems of people who want, you know, this memory and all that, because they keep talking about memory, which is subjective, instead of talking about facts. That's what really makes me mad, you know. Why don't they talk about facts, you know? Let's shift the language, you know.
The country that does a really good job of this is Germany, actually.
Yeah, exactly. But they took a long time too. Yeah. And I don't know, you know, like 50 years have passed. So it's time, but maybe 50 years have passed and, you know, who cares enough anymore? I don't know. Mm-hmm.
My question is how this fear of change has been manifested in this 2022 referendum for plurinationality.
The what has manifested? Sorry?
The fear of political instability
Oh.
in the 2022 referendum.
Yeah, on the constitutional draft, yeah. Well, in case other people don't know, but there's been, you know, a new constitutional draft that was designed by a constitutional convention that was very dominated by, you know, leftists and progressives and all that, which went to great lengths to include a lot of detailed issues that should be part of legislation and not the Constitution. And they also gave indigenous peoples a lot of authority and control over lands and their own decision-making and their own justice system, or at least that's how it was worded. That was one of the main issues that a lot of people, you know, were afraid of and decided to vote no against the Constitution, but also because it encompassed so many issues, you know, and it wasn't really representative of this huge sector of Chilean society, I would say 40%, who are conservative. And we forget that we have 40% of the population that is conservative. And so I think they freaked out with all of this stuff. They should have made a draft that was more generic, more general, you know. So they voted against the Constitution. And now there's another group that's dominated by the right and the ultra-right, which is doing the exact same thing but with their own issues. So I don't know where that's going to go. But in terms of indigenous issues, that was one of the major factors that led people to vote against the Constitution, because they said it gave them disproportional presence and power and autonomy. So they talked about indigenous nations and not groups, not, you know. So a lot of people were afraid because there is a conflict with the Mapuche in the south, which has become increasingly violent because it's no longer about lands. There's a lot of drug trafficking involved, weapons trafficking. There's a lot of criminal mafias kind of inserting themselves in the conflict, so we don't know who's who anymore. There's a lot of that going on, and it's very violent. So people are afraid, you know, how are we going to give these people more autonomy, not land, but autonomy to make decisions when this is going on. So that really scared off people. Yeah. And it's really hard to understand the Mapuche conflict now because they're very radicalized groups, and the majority of Mapuche are not. But this has been intertwined with all these criminal organizations that are operating in the same area. Yeah.
Can I just add something
Yeah.
to that? Is that to understand Chilean society, there's two things that are important. One is the level of racism we have, because we live with the myth that there's no races, that we are all white. And that's part of the history of relationship in the country. And the second is classism. You meet a Chilean and you ask immediately on the first 5 minutes which high school they attended.
Or where do you live? Or where do you live?
And that's based on that, you put them on the invisible scale of who's worth more.
Yep.
So, or your last name or stuff like that. So those two are things that cross society and help you, once you understand them, it helps you understand a bit of the different visions about political issues. And the aspiration of middle and low middle classes to achieve a level of consumption where they can demonstrate that they are part of the middle class, and that can lead to denial of own origin. So those are complex issues that cross the political and the visions about the transition and human rights foundation.
Yeah.
Sorry for
No, but that's true. I mean, classism and racism. And when we had a huge influx of Haitians in the country, I mean, that was so horrible. But it's very strange because if you have Black Americans, they're like, oh, great, you know, really interesting. But you have Haitians coming in, and they were so mistreated, they were so discriminated in jobs and housing and everything, that they started leaving, you know. I mean, Chileans are extremely classist and racist, and they don't want to accept their own origin at all.
I found that so interesting what you're saying, because I met somebody from Chile. He's in Chile. He wants to come here, and we've been talking we're both writers. He's a poet, but I find that so interesting. How he says, Claudia, I'm from, my family is from this legacy of the last names. He tells me that's like so important to him.
Yeah.
And he's only 37 years old, so for us that's like okay. He tells me how everybody's a doctor, they have degrees, and they're all famous. His father, too. It's like so important for them. And what high school he went to, he told me.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
That's exactly true.
It's Claudia, like me, Claudia. But he says, Claudia, yeah, that's how it is. You got to ask them, and you'll see. It's important. And also that he doesn't have Mapuche in him.
Of course.
He doesn't have Mapuche. So I'm like, I guess that's very nice that you don't have it. Blood. I just find it fascinating how we don't think in that, we don't see things in that perspective over here.
Yeah.
For them, it's.
I have to disagree with you. I have to disagree with you about that. I think that's our own blindness to our own classism and racism because, everyone's middle class. Unless there's something wrong with it.
But I don't think that the last name thing is so typically Chilean or Latin American. Like in 1985, I was at George Washington University, And there was a new Chilean ambassador in Washington, Errázuriz was his last name, which aristocracy. So he came to talk to my class. I wanted to die. And so one of the first things he's like, oh, so who here is from Latin America? Who here is from Chile? And I was like, should I raise my hand? Should I? So I rose my hand, and he says, oh, so what do you think? Do you think that because my last name is Errázuriz, I will have more acceptance here? Hernan Felipe.
Yeah.
Hernan Felipe, not Hernan Felipe, is also composed names. Yeah, and I was like, what? I mean, he's representing a dictatorship. Who cares about his last name? But he had this mentality that he would, have a better reception. And I don't know if your friend is like thinking, oh, will I be better, accepted because of all my pedigree,
Yeah, so he
It's-
said that, that's when you're white, it's easier for you.
Yeah,
You don't talk like that. If he wants to come here, I'm like, you can't speak like that.
exactly, yeah.
But he doesn't know. He doesn't know.
He's going to be canceled really quick.
I'm Casanova, so make sure, they know that.
Casanova. Yeah.
Alright.
Anything else?
We
No?
should probably,
Wrap it up.
maybe one more question, Laura?
Oh.
I actually had one going back to what you said is like things being treated as memory rather than fact.
Mhm.
And so my biggest question is how do we move from memory to fact? Or like if there are things that Chile is working on or an agenda or ideas about how you move, and it's also experience, right? When you report experiences that you've had like violence, right? Violence against women, that's an experience.
Mm.
It's treated as an experience.
Not a
Well-
fact, you
well,
mean?
yeah, it's not treated as a fact, right? When you report, it's not treated as a fact, it's treated as your own personal experience. So how do we move from experience and memory to fact? And of course, like you said before, 40% or a certain chunk of the population will always be deniers. There are Holocaust deniers. There are deniers that there were internment camps of Japanese, right?
No, the 40% isn't denier.
Right,
They're
right,
right
but
wing,
they're bullied, right? There's always
Yeah,
gonna be
but there
people
always
who
is,
deny,
yeah.
there will always be people who say that never happened. But for everybody else, how do we
Yeah.
how do we start
I don't think, the people who say that never happened, I don't think, it's this,
Oh, right,
the
like,
problem
you
is they
can't-
justify it,
Yeah.
they justify it. I don't know, I think changing the language, my own personal mission is writing these books with facts, with documents, that you can't dispute it, and their own documents. These are documents from the dictatorship, so it's their own making. But you have schools. I really insist this has to be educational programs. That really has to happen, and it's not happening at all because every time, like the public school system, they try to have a text. There's always, someone or groups that say, no, that's one-sided or that's biased, and so they have to throw it away. And there's actually been textbooks thrown away because they're not accepted. So it all kind of, yeah,
Just like,
Right, not
just
just
like
in
Florida.
Chile. And,
yeah.
yeah,
So I really, I think it's horrible, and university professors, like at least at my university, which is more liberal than the Catholic University, for example. For this 50-year anniversary, every single professor in their class did something about the 50-year anniversary. Everyone showed movies. I'm making them, like last week, I made them go to an event and write about it, Others took them to Villa Grimaldi, to a former concentration center. Others, did other things. We forced them to do this. And a lot of them have no idea about this. I don't know what can be done. I think you really have to treat it as history. And that has to be, even top down from the government. That has to be a decision of the education ministry. And the thing is, high school students sometimes, there's such poor level of education. I get first-year university students who come from high schools, and they say, well, we didn't really cover the dictatorship or the transition because there was no time. So basically, we just covered until 1960 or 65 or whatever, because we didn't have time to cover the entire history. It's like, I've heard that from my students, So what they have to, learn on the side, whatever they can, and some do and some don't. I don't know. I wish I knew the answer. I stopped talking about memory a long time ago. I don't like it.